I think we've only just begun the adjustment process, and growth rates are going to slow down a lot more. My expectation is that under President Xi's term, roughly from 2013 to 2023, average growth rates are unlikely to exceed 3 to 4%.
Really?
And that's not my prediction. That's the upper limit of my prediction. I really don't think China's going to be able to grow much faster than that. And that may seem like a very surprising statement, and certainly a few years ago it was considered even more surprising. But there are two sets of reasons why I think that's likely to be the case. The first is very straightforward. It's just the historical precedents. We've had, depending on how you define a growth miracle, we've had perhaps 30 to 40 of them since the Second World War. I define it as more than 10 years of more than 7% growth. And they all follow very similar patterns. There's very little variation. In the early stages, these countries tend to have very low levels of investment relative to their absorption capacity. So in that case, the best strategy is to increase investment as rapidly as possible, and that's what they all do. But undeveloped countries, the difference between a China and a UK is not that the UK has more investment. It's probably institutional. It probably has something to do with the financial system, the legal system, all of these other issues. So rich countries are able to absorb higher levels of capital more productively. Almost by definition, a poor country can't do that. So a country like China, with very high levels of investment, the highest ever recorded, and very high growth rates of investment, it was always likely to reach a point at which it was no longer able to absorb it productively. And I believe we reached that point quite a long time ago. Most people agree that we've passed that point. The debate is how long. And once that happens, almost by definition, debt is growing faster than debt servicing capacity. And when that happens, of course, that means debt is growing unsustainably. So it's probably not a surprise under those conditions that every single growth miracle, certainly since World War II and probably before, has ended either in a debt crisis or in a lost decade or two lost decades in the case of Japan of very, very low growth. But the real differences conceptually between China and the precedents are that the imbalances have been taken to levels in China that we've never seen before in history, particularly the consumption imbalance. We've never seen such a low consumption level. And credit is growing faster than we've ever seen before. So the Chinese exceptionalism probably suggests a greater rather than a lesser likelihood of following that pattern.
What's the prognosis in broad terms? If you've got a lot of people say you need a certain level of growth in China to have, for it to be socially stable.
China has roughly 1/5 of the world's population, and certainly by most measures, it is much less than 1/5 of almost anything. So we're going to see a lot of that catching up. But I think the economic expectations for China have been vastly overstated. I don't think China is going to come anywhere close to achieving some of the expectations, certainly that we had 3 or 4 years ago. I think, and again, the historical precedents suggest this, is that perceptions are slowly catching up to the reality, but they're going to continue to lag it for a few more years.
The government says 7% is baked in, it's certain. You're saying that half of that is optimistic?
Yes. I think that if President Xi is able to pull off average growth rates of 3 to 4% during his 10 years in office, he will have accomplished something that we should really be astonished. It would be truly impressive, almost on par with what Deng Xiaoping did in the 1980s, because he's inherited a much more difficult economy than we think. There's a huge amount of debt. There's a huge amount of unrecognized bad debt. And there is a financial system structured around a very unbalanced type of relationship with external volatility. And it's going to be very costly to adjust. But if the adjustment is done correctly, the cost of the adjustment will be passed on to what in China are referred to as the vested interests. They benefited disproportionately from 30 years of growth. But they will also have to pay a disproportionate share of the costs. One of the implications is that if I'm right and Chinese growth does drop as much as I expect it to, we will not have the social disturbances that many people assume, because the growth rate of ordinary households will drop by much less than the growth rate of the economy. So 3 to 4% growth rates, average growth rates for China, would be consistent with 5 to 6% growth in household income. And rebalancing by definition means household income has to grow faster than GDP.
A lot of people see things in terms of markets, and obviously that fall in what happened in Shanghai scared a lot of people. Was that significant, and was that in and of itself a harbinger for future chaos, or is that just something else entirely?
It should have been, and among many people, it was fairly well expected. Not the specifics, but in the adjustment process, during the growth period, there's a tendency to structure balance sheets in such a way that they exacerbate growth. It's basically very speculative balance sheets. And that's a winning strategy when everything's going well. During the adjustment process, that same sort of balance sheet structure always leads to great difficulty and disruption within the financial sector. And China has not proven to be an exception. The key is government credibility. Credibility is very high in China. It was damaged a little bit in the last 6 months, but it remains very high. And as long as it's high, we will not have a financial crisis. And I suspect that that's the more likely expectation.